Hello friends, in this video session, we are going to discuss a few common questions that are asked in the exams. So let's start with it. Question number one for us. A 75-year-old male presents in the OPD with worsening of the frontal headache, drowsiness and forgetfulness. A CT is performed which is shown here. What is the diagnosis? The finding in this non-contrast CT scan, if you see the frontal area over here, this is what the finding is. A concavo-convex hematoma is seen, which has consolidated. So this is a typical finding of the subdural hematoma. And as this subdural hematoma has consolidated, this is a chronic subdural hematoma as this has become consolidated. Fine. So the answer to this question is chronic subdural hematoma. Question number two. Management of flail chest with respiratory failure is. The management of flail chest with respiratory failure is intermittent positive pressure ventilation through or with the help of the endotracheal intubation. What happens in flail chest is that in a number of polytrauma patients, the patients of thoracic trauma, if there is a fracture of more than two consecutive ribs, and if each rib is fractured at more than one side, that is two or more than two sides, then a free segment precipitates, which during inspiration, when there is negative pressure inside the thorax, this free segment is pulled inside. A flail chest means that there is a free segment in the chest wall which is moving paradoxically with respiration. With inspiration, it moves inside. And the management of the flail chest is intermittent positive pressure ventilation. Question number three. What is the most common site for inserting needle in tension pneumothorax? The answer to this question is that it is the fifth intercostal space in the mid-axillary line. This is a change that has been added a few years back. In the past, what we used to do is that the emergency management, the guidelines were, is to be drained in the emergency, the pneumothorax is to be drained by the insertion of a valved needle in the second intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. But this has been changed now. In adults now, the emergency management of pneumothorax is to insert the needle in the fourth or the fifth intercostal space in the mid-axillary line. So remember this, that this is a change. Question number four. This is how the pneumothorax appears on the X-rays. The first X-ray is very clearly showing us hyperlucency of the whole right lung over here. Everything has become hyperlucent. In this second X-ray also, we can see the hyperlucency in the outer part over here, and there is a collapse of the lung margin. The lung margins are shown with the white arrows. So these two are both the X-rays seen in pneumothorax. The next question. Which of these is not a pre-malignant lesion? There are a number of pre-malignant lesions in the esophagus for esophageal carcinoma. The most important risk factors for the esophageal cancer are, first of all, tobacco, smoking or chewing. This is by far the most important risk factor. The second important risk factor for the squamous cell carcinoma in the esophagus is achalasia cardia. The third important risk factor for the squamous cell carcinoma in the esophagus is something known as the Plummer-Vinson syndrome. In Plummer-Vinson syndrome, there are esophageal webs. And For the adenocarcinoma of the esophagus, which is seen in the lower one third, the most important risk factor is the Barrett's esophagus. In Barrett's esophagus, there is intestinal metaplasia of the lower esophagus. The squamous cells lining the esophagus in the lower esophagus, due to repeated exposure to acid, they are converted into the columnar epithelium and ultimately may develop goblet cells. This is known as the Barrett's esophagus, and this is a risk factor or a pre-malignant lesion for the esophageal cancer adenocarcinoma. So amongst all of these, the only lesion which has no risk per se for the development of the esophageal cancer is hiatus hernia. There is no risk of esophageal cancer with hiatus hernia. The next question here is, hyperchloremic alkalosis is seen in achalasia cardia, hypertrophic pyloric stenosis, diarrhea, or ureterosigmoidostomy. Hyperchloremic alkalosis is seen in all those cases where during vomiting the gastric acid is vomited. There should be loss of chloride. In achalasia cardia, there is no loss of chloride as the lower esophageal junction is blocked. In diarrhea, definitely this is not a vomiting. In ureterosigmoidostomy also, once again, there is acidosis. So whatever conditions that leads to vomiting with the HCl coming out leading to a decrease in chloride leads to hypochloremic alkalosis. What happens here is that due to decrease in chloride, the body starts absorbing bicarbonate from the renal system. Increased resorption of bicarbonate from the urinary system. The end effect of this, or the effect of this, is precipitation of alkalosis and urine becoming acidic. Urine becomes acidic. So this is what is seen, that there is alkalosis due to hypochloremia, and paradoxically there is acidosis, because normally in alkalosis the urine should be alkaline, but in this condition the urine has become acidic. So the answer to this is hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. By far the commonest metabolic abnormality of hypertrophic pyloric stenosis is hypochloremic alkalosis with hypokalemia with paradoxical aciduria. Greatest risk of malignant transformation in gastric cancers is associated with the greatest risk, or one of the greatest risk for the gastric cancers, is the intestinal metaplasia. Intestinal metaplasia may be associated with a number of conditions, but by far the most common condition that precipitates intestinal metaplasia in the stomach is the infection by H. pylori. H. pylori causes the active gastritis. This active gastritis leads to intestinal metaplasia, and intestinal metaplasia leads to the development of gastric cancer. Duodenal ulcers, on the other hand, they don't have any risk, or there is very minimal risk for any malignant transformation. Intestinal hyperplasia also, there is minimal risk for the malignant conversion. Pre-pyloric ulcers are the same as the duodenal ulcers. So the answer in this condition is the intestinal metaplasia. The next question, a 5-year-old boy presents with massive hematemesis. He is not febrile. Per abdomen examination reveals massive splenomegaly without hepatomegaly. the most probable diagnosis would be? The most probable diagnosis in this child is just 5 years old. The most probable diagnosis is likely to be extrahepatic portal venous obstruction. What happens in this condition with the extrahepatic portal venous obstruction? Extrahepatic portal venous obstruction is a vascular disorder of the liver which results in obstruction and cavernomatous transformation of the portal vein. So there is cavernomatous transformation of the portal vein. This is a vascular disorder of the liver resulting in the blockage of the portal vein. The extrahepatic portal venous obstruction is the most common cause of portal hypertension and variceal bleed in the children. So the most common cause of portal hypertension and variceal bleeding in children is extrahepatic portal venous obstruction. By far, the commonest presentation of the extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, that is EHPVO, is variceal bleeding. The commonest presentation, variceal bleeding. In the Indian subcontinent, 20 to 30% of all variceal bleeds in children are due to the extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, that is portal venous thrombosis. The management of this, as we have the varices that are forming due to the portal venous obstruction, portal hypertension, band ligation of the varices is done. Band ligation is the superior management of the variceal or the esophageal varices in comparison to sclerotherapy. So the treatment of choice for esophageal varices is band ligation, both in the adults and in the children. In this question, a 68-year-old male is admitted to the emergency room with a history of 3 large maroon colored stools. So this is an elderly presenting to us with maroon colored stools, meaning thereby there is fresh blood. On admission, he passes more bloody clots and stools. He is pale, meaning anemic, orthostatic and tachycardic. The nasogastric aspirates are bilious. After resuscitation, which of the following is the most appropriate initial test? When such patient present to us, which as per the question appears to be that he is hemodynamically compromised, the first thing is to stabilize the patient. Once the patient is stabilized, as this is maroon colored stools, we have to check out from where the bleeding is coming. This bleeding is most likely from the colon. And therefore, the most important investigation that we can do in this condition is colonoscopy. All of the following are true regarding Crohn's disease except fistula formation, skip lesion, recurrence is common after surgery, and inflammation is limited to mucosa. Mind you that the question is asking except. This means that 3 of these are seen with the Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disease, the etiology of which is not known. Though there are a number of theories that this may be autoimmune, this may be infective, this may be genetic, there are a number of theories for it. The characteristic features of Crohn's disease are that Crohn's disease may involve any part of the intestine, starting from the oral cavity up to the anal opening. This disease tends to be discontinuous, that one area of the intestine is involved, then another area is involved, and in between these 2 areas, there is an area which is normal, and therefore the skip lesions are seen. Crohn's disease, the inflammation involves all the layers of the intestine, starting from the mucosa, moving outwards, and involve all the layer of the wall. The inflammation of all the layer of the wall ultimately may lead to fistula formation and abscess formation. So amongst all of these, the wrong one is that inflammation is limited to mucosa only. The inflammation in Crohn's disease is going to involve all the layers of the intestine. This is the cobblestone appearance that is characteristically seen with the Crohn's disease on endoscopy. This can be seen anywhere in the intestine. In comparison from ulcerative colitis, the ulcerative colitis usually involves the colon. It does not involve the small intestine or anything above it. And in ulcerative colitis, there is no involvement of the outer layers of the intestine. It is usually limited to the inner layers like the mucosa and the submucosa. In this question, which of the following is used to detect mucosa in Meckel's diverticulum? Meckel's diverticulum is by far one of the most common congenital anomalies that can be seen in the small intestine. This is just a remnant of the omphalomesenteric duct. Meckel's diverticulum is seen approximately 2 feet proximal to the ileocecal junction. It is seen in approximately 2% of the population. Almost most of the patient of this Meckel's diverticulum are children. We can say that somewhere around 50% or more than 50% of the patient of Meckel's diverticulum are children. So it is more common in children. This is the rule of 2 regarding the Meckel's diverticulum. Seen in 2% of the population, 2 feet proximal to the ileocecal junction. Half the patient are children. This Meckel's diverticulum may contain gastric mucosa. This gastric mucosa in the Meckel's diverticulum can be diagnosed with the help of a technetium-99 scan. Technetium-99 scan will work only if the Meckel's diverticulum contains the gastric mucosa. If it does not contain the gastric mucosa, in that scenario, technetium-99 scan will not show the Meckel's diverticulum. Ochsner-Cherren regime is used for, this is the next question. Ochsner-Cherren regime is used for appendicular mass. The management or the conservative management of the appendicular mass is known as the Ochsner-Cherren regime. In a number of cases of appendicitis, an appendicular mass may form, and the management of this appendicular mass includes a number of things to be done. Provided that the condition of the patient is stable, the standard management of the appendicular mass is known as the Ochsner-Cherren regime. This regime includes the patient should be made nil per oral and parenteral nutrition should be started. Prophylactic antibiotics should be given to the patient. For pain relief, analgesia should be given to the patient. A proper fluid charting should be done. Input and output chart should be maintained properly. Temperature, pulse, and respiration recording should be done 4-hourly, and daily mass recording. This total thing together over here is known as the Ochsner-Cherren regime. Nowadays, this regime is not being followed as such. The reason being that it has been seen that the endoscopic appendectomy has better results and lesser morbidity. So instead of going in with the Ochsner-Cherren regime, nowadays we straight away go with the removal of the mass or the appendix, that is appendectomy. Samoma bodies are seen in which thyroid cancer? Samoma bodies are seen with the papillary thyroid cancer. Papillary thyroid cancer is the most common thyroid cancer in iodine sufficient area, meaning in those areas where there is no deficiency of iodine. In iodine deficient area, definitely it is the follicular carcinoma which is common. This papillary carcinoma has a number of characteristic features on histology. Papillary carcinoma on histology, we may find out the Samoma bodies, we may see the orphan NEI nuclei, there may be some other inclusion bodies seen. So this is our papillary carcinoma of the thyroid. Samoma bodies or orphan NEI nuclei are seen with which thyroid cancer? Once again, the answer is going to be papillary thyroid cancer. Golf hole ureteric orifice is seen in some conditions of the urinary bladder. When there is a fibrosis of the urinary bladder, the ureteric opening moves a little bit towards the upper side, and because of fibrosis, the ureteric orifice is always open. So it moves a little bit upward and is always open. This type of ureteric orifice is known as the golf hole ureteric orifice. And those conditions that cause fibrosis of the urinary bladder are very likely to precipitate it. Amongst these answers, the most likely cause that can cause fibrosis in the urinary bladder is the tuberculosis of the urinary bladder. So the answer for this question is the bladder tuberculosis or tuberculosis of the urinary bladder. What is the most chemosensitive testicular tumor? The most chemosensitive testicular tumor is seminoma. Actually, seminoma, wherever it happens, it is a highly chemosensitive and also radiosensitive tumor. And only chemotherapy or radiotherapy may be used for the management of this testicular tumor or this germ cell tumor. Seminomas most commonly are seen in the testis. They may also appear in the mediastinum. Mediastinal seminomas are most common in the anterior mediastinum. So overall, the commonest site of seminoma, testis. The most common extra-testicular site or the commonest mediastinal site of seminoma, we have the anterior mediastinum. And the commonest management done for seminomas, at least in the mediastinum, is chemotherapy. One of our cricketers too had this disease and he was treated with chemotherapy. So that's it for this lecture. Thank you.